Jesus is headed for Jerusalem, where he will be arrested and executed. He and his disciples show up at the home of Martha and Mary in the town of Bethany, which is just outside Jerusalem. Martha immediately begins rushing around, getting a meal ready. Her sister Mary sits at Jesus' feet with the rest of the disciples. Martha gets frustrated with her role as kitchen help, while her sister is elevated to the role of disciple. So she interrupts Jesus, who is teaching his disciples, to demand that he order her sister to help her. How does Jesus respond to this demand? Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. At first reading, Jesus' response seems to suggest that it is better to sit at his feet than to be busy in the kitchen. That the quiet, contemplative life is to be preferred over the busy, active life. As you might imagine, this story has bothered a lot of people, a lot of Marthas over the years. After all, the sisters have guests. They need to be provided a meal. That's just good manners. As one of the hostesses, of course Mary should be in the kitchen helping Martha, right? Perhaps. When someone comes to your house for dinner, what do? You usher them to a comfortable place to sit. You offer them something to drink. If there are two of you hosting this dinner, you and your spouse, or you and your sister, for instance, then usually one of you returns to the kitchen to finish preparing for the meal, while the other sits with the guests. You don't both go to the kitchen and abandon your guests to their own conversation. And if you're the one in the kitchen, if you do need help, you ask your spouse or your sister to give you a hand in the kitchen. But that's not what Martha does. She is so busy trying to get dinner ready for this big crowd of guests that she becomes distracted. That's the word our text gives us, distracted, suggesting that she became emotionally upset and maybe even a little confused. So confused that she does something quite unusual. Instead of asking her sister for help, she goes to the guest of honor and demands that he order her sister to help. There's a word for this kind of behavior. It's called triangulation. Here is how Dr. Allison Paulson has described triangulation. Triangulation involves one person complaining to a third person about a primary relationship in order to vent anxiety, not necessarily to gain insight into how to deal with a problem. Triangulating someone into your angst-ridden relationship temporarily relieves anxiety. People who feel helpless to change their relationships sometimes seek to relieve their frustration through complaints and criticisms of their partner or their mother, their son, their friend. Through the power of secrets, they may also temporarily feel connected, a connection that may be lacking in the primary relationship. However, that temporary feeling of connection and release of anxiety is like the effect of a drug. It's short-lived, and you will need more complaining to get the same relief next time. Triangulation is an insidious thing as mold growing in the walls. While it's hard to see the destruction, eventually the structure crumbles. In the end, complaining and listening to complaints is emotionally exhausting and usually not constructive. Being asked to take sides rather than having a dialogue is draining, futile, and brings everyone down. The reality is that sometimes folks do just need to vent. And if it's your ear they use, there's nothing wrong with listening while someone vents. But if the venting is about a third person, a third party, it's best to just listen and not get directly involved. I guarantee you there's another side to the story somewhere. Now you might suggest that the person go directly to the third party and express their feelings, but avoid the temptation to play savior and try to fix the situation by getting personally involved. My experience is that usually does not turn out too well. So Jesus listens to Martha's complaint about her sister, but he does not engage in triangulation. He doesn't judge her, but he does recognize that she is distracted, that she is emotionally unstable at the moment. So he simply tells her to leave Mary alone. Martha is emotionally upset at that moment. I think that's the key to understanding this passage. Jesus is not condemning doing over being. He's not suggesting the passive life is better than the active life. The story we heard last week, which in the gospel is just before this story, was about the Good Samaritan. And that was all about taking action. But perhaps, at that particular moment, Jesus is saying Mary chose the better part. At that moment, sitting at Jesus' feet and allowing him to teach was to be preferred by being in the kitchen cooking. At that moment, it was the better way. Let's look at the moment. Jesus is headed towards Jerusalem and his death. He knows this. There is an urgency to his mission now. He knows that he's running out of time. He feels compelled to teach the disciples as much as he possibly can. He needs to teach. Apparently, his need to teach at that moment is greater than his need for a meal. Seen in that way, perhaps Mary is being a good hostess at that moment. She sees her guest's need, his need to teach, and so she responds by sitting and listening. Beyond that, I think the story is about balance. This world needs Marthas. This world also needs Marys. And hopefully each of us are a little bit of both. There is a time for action, but there is also a time for us to be still and know that God is God. If we are so busy that we never find time for prayer, for worship, for contemplation, if we never find time to be in the presence of God, all those things we do for God are going to wear us out and become distractions. Balance is important. To live the active life, we have to build in times when we recharge our own batteries. Many years ago, I said Mass for the Sisters of the Holy Nativity every Tuesday morning. We jokingly referred to the Sisters of the Holy Nativity as the Holy Nats. And they giggled when we called them the Holy Nats. They didn't bother them. Well, I did this for 3 years, every Tuesday morning. And this was really my first in-depth experience of the religious life. I never spent much time around nuns or monks. That's not my cup of tea personally. But after a while, I got to understand some very strange things that the sisters did. For instance, if you were having a conversation with them or telling them a story, and the bell rang for a chapel, they would get a faraway look in their eyes, and as one person, turn and head for the chapel. Now, at first, I used to get offended. I mean, I was telling a really good story. And in the middle of the story, they just turn and walk away. Chapel was a priority. That time of prayer was more important than any story that I could come up with. It took me a while to understand that. Another thing that it took a while for me to understand was that when I left every Tuesday morning, the last thing one of the sisters would do, they always escorted you to the door. The last thing one of the sisters would do, whoever was escorting me, she would turn to me and say, "Father, we're praying for you." Well, that's nice. They're praying for me. Okay. And I didn't think much of it. They were being polite, I figured. Until one day I was at the convent in the middle of the day, which didn't happen that often. Sometimes we ran errands for the sisters. They didn't like to drive. So anyway, I'm at the convent, and I'm walking by the chapel, and one of the sisters is in that chapel in devotion before the Blessed Sacrament. And she's in another place. She doesn't hear me. She doesn't hear anything. And it dawned on me that for these sisters, praying is not just some kind of, of course kind of thing, polite kind of thing. It's a deeply ingrained part of their day-to-day life. Once I realized that, sometimes when I'd be going through a difficult meeting, or developing a food program, or doing something as an active priest, I'd remember that those sisters were holding me up in prayer. And I have to say that I found comfort in knowing I was being held up in prayer by the Holy Nuns. Those sisters also taught me a bit about the importance of balance. Their days were broken up in a balance of prayer, work, study, and rest. All are essential to living a balanced spiritual life. But prayer came first for those sisters, and I think they were right. Being in God's presence comes first. It is the better way, as Jesus described it. Why is it the better way? We remember the great commandment, love God and love your neighbor, and it has to be in that order. It is through our relationship with God that we learn how to love our neighbor. If we are too busy to nurture our relationship with God through prayer and worship, we will become distracted, and we will be less prepared when the time comes for us to express our love for our neighbor. As Martin Luther once put it, I have so much to do that I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer. May our spiritual lives be balanced. May we always remember that our relationship with God is our primary relationship. Then when our lives get busy, we will not say, I'm too busy to pray. Instead, when we begin to feel overwhelmed with our many and varied activities, we will remember to stop and recharge our batteries. When our lives are full, we will then follow the example of Martin Luther and say to ourselves, I am so busy that I must take time